Back on July the 12th in 1997, the motor show started on Channel 9 in Perth. There were more than 300 episodes, and during those episodes we featured many veteran and vintage cars that were supplied by our good friend Peter Briggs. Today, Peter has invited us into his Undercroft garage to take another look at some of those fabulous vehicles. Peter's magnificent 18-car garage holds the creme de la creme of his car collection. The rest is located at the famous York Motor Museum in the Avon Valley, the longest-running private motor museum in Australia. Peter is a passionate car collector, and his interest spans every era of motoring. The Undercroft holds not only some of the great cars of motoring history, but also memorabilia spanning the beginning of the age of motoring to recent events such as the Australian Grand Prix. Peter and his wife Robin have participated in some of the great motoring events from around the world for the last 4 decades, and pictures of their motoring life cover the walls. Many of Peter's cars have a great history of their own, and historical photographs, trophies and memorabilia fill every wall and every nook and cranny in this wonderful space. Peter believes that cars are to be driven, so every car in this garage is regularly run on the streets of Perth or shipped interstate or overseas for rallies, car shows and big events. Well, we're now joined here in the Undercroft garage by Peter Briggs. Peter, thanks very much for allowing us to come down and look at your fabulous collection. Tell us a little bit about yourself and motoring over the years.
Well, I guess the era started when I was 6 in the UK, when my dad bought me a pedal car. And from there on in, I was fascinated with all things motoring. Before we left England in '48, us kids used to stand on street corners saying, "Oh, what model car is that? Oh, what year is it? What's that number plate mean?" That was sort of an afternoon's entertainment for us. We came to Australia, of course, and Sydney initially, and weren't much into cars, mostly going to school, and then finally ended up in Perth, where we wanted to come in the first place, because it was the only white, English-speaking Mediterranean country. I don't know why my mother ever said white, but she wanted white. Country as far away as possible from London and the wars. But after that, of course, started off with in 50s Morris Minor convertible, which was a lot of fun. Didn't know anything about motor cars, of course, and I wanted to make more noise because I thought noise was sort of sounded racy. So, because I was a carpenter's apprentice, so I got a punch and a hammer and punched holes in the end of the muffler to make more noise. I didn't realise it should come out of the pipe. I did learn after a while, of course. But I guess from a period, beginning of the 60s when we got married, I bought my first proper car, which was an MG-TF. And there was no MG car club, so I was involved with a group of fellow MG enthusiasts, and we started the MG car club in Western Australia. And then I bought an MGA, and I started racing around the old circuit at Caversham. And we did all those clubby things, standing quarter miles and concours d'elegances, and I liked all that club stuff. That was an interesting period. We first met in York at the Settlers Inn back in about 1979. How did you come to become involved in York? Well, Jim Harwood, who's an old car dealer friend of mine, we were at the 1979 National Rolls-Royce Concours in Kings Park. And he said to me, "What are you doing with your cars, Briggsy?" And I said, "Well, I'm having trouble." He said, "What sort of trouble?" He said, "I've got nowhere to put them all." And I only had probably 10 cars or something. And he said, "Well, I'm going to retire in York. So why don't you," and there's a building in the main drag, Avon Terrace. I thought, well, I'll never be able to buy a block in St George's Terrace. I'll buy one in Avon Terrace. And so I said, how much is it? And he said, 13,250. I said, what, that's the deposit or the first year's payment? He said, no, that buys the whole building. I'll buy it. Well, I didn't even look at it. I said, I'll buy it. And so we bought that building and we bought the building next door. And I put all my little sports cars, now I had probably 12 or 14 cars in there, and all these little English sports cars, and they all look the same. And I thought, if you've got to have a museum, you've got to have interesting cars, preferably with provenance, for other people to find it interesting. And so we started with the museum in York, and we bought the Settler's House over the road and a few other buildings. In order to promote the museum, you had to realise there was nothing that happened in York when we arrived, and you had to promote York. So we thought, well, what do we do? Well, let's have a around the houses race. That should get people up here. And a couple of years, well, 1 year or 2 years went by, and a television company came up, I think it was Channel 9, and he said, you should promote this. We'll sponsor you. We used to get 2,000 or 3,000 people at our Around the Houses. And so I was driving my blower Bentley around. They took pictures of everything, and so they sponsored us. And quite a bit of free advertising, which we thought was wonderful. And 15,000 people turned up. They couldn't get in.
Well, that was indeed Channel 9, because I was working with Channel 9 at the time, and I was the MC at the end of the Perth to York vintage rally, and I stood in the middle of the street and interviewed everybody.
Well, I'd done the London to Brighton in a 1901 Clement, and that's 60 miles, and Perth to York was 60 miles. So I said to the Veteran Car Club, we should have a sort of a London to Brighton thing. And of course, it's all pre-1905 cars. And I had most of the pre-1905 cars in Perth. So apart from sponsoring it, we said, look, we'll open it to everybody. Every car, whatever. And the Veteran Car Club said, oh, you can't have non-members. I said, why not? Oh. Few hundred people turned out that came out of the woodwork with their old cars and funny sort of cars, and the club ended up with about 60 new members, and everybody was happy. But it was a great event.
So from York you actually moved some of the collection to Fremantle?
We moved during the America's Cup in '87. We thought we'd capitalise on all the tourists going to Fremantle. And Rolly Chasker had a building on the left-hand side going over the traffic bridge, was his sail loft on the top floor, which wasn't being used. So we said, can we put a car museum up there? Yeah, she's a beauty. So we put in 30 or 40 cars. There's some pictures up there of the museum, and for the America's Cup. But what I didn't know, and I spent a reasonable little bit of money on it, everybody was going to Fremantle to see the America's Cup, and then when they'd finished, they'd go home. They didn't want to stop at a car museum.
Well, of course, talking about the America's Cup, apart from your other loves of motoring and Robin, your love of yachting is well known.
Yes. I was a late starter in yachting. I wasn't the typical Australian boy that learnt to sail. I certainly learnt to swim, but I never learnt to sail. I went sailing with a friend of mine, Brian Johnson, in an Base Sailor 24. And having stepped out of racing cars, I said, why are we going so slow? Why is that guy over there going past us? Put your foot on the accelerator. No, Briggs, doesn't work like that. No. It's very skillful. You've got to pick the wind and all this sort of stuff. Oh, this is very strange. Anyway, I went broke as a property developer because I started off life as a carpenter and became a builder. And then I studied and became a quantity surveyor. And then I became a property developer and a millionaire property developer, multi-millionaire property developer, and a bankrupt property developer. It seems to be a format that property developers go through. And after that I said, right, got to do something else. And a friend of mine called Peter Briggs, who you might remember, had a company called Siberia Nickel Exploration. And after the Poseidon boom, which was this 66 to 72 period, everybody had these public companies, and they had no money. They had creditors and commitments. And this guy said, I'll give you one of my companies, Siberia Nickel. I said, I'll take it. And then, what do I do with it? Who are these people ringing me up wanting to be paid? Then we discovered a lovely new currency. It's called give them paper in the company. Oh, that's all you're going to get. Oh, okay, we'll take it.
Well, of course, you've had over 40 companies.
Yes. Oh, over the years we've had well, people used to give them to me. One guy rang me up and said, I've got 6 public listed companies, merchant banker in Sydney. Briggsy? Yep, Ian Murray from Slater Walker. And he said, I want to give them to you. I hear you collecting them. I said, yeah, you send them over. He said, I want $43 for them. I said, that's a lot of money. I'm taking off a liability off your hands. Oh, okay, forget it, $43. That was the cost of his proprietary company that he wanted to sell.
Well, of course, you appeared on one of my programs talking about those companies. I think it was the forerunner to Australian Gas.
Yes, Australian Nickel was the previous one, yes. Well, nickel was all the go, and during the Poseidon boom, one of the successful companies was a company called Australian Nickel. And the name had lapsed, and the nickel price was going up a few years ago. And I thought I'd do another nickel float, and found it a lot harder than it used to be, and changed it into oil and gas company, Australian Gas and Power.
Well, of course, you appeared in the first motor show with the blower Bentley, and indeed you still have a Bentley here in your Undercroft garage.
Yes, certainly. The 3-litre Bentley, which is the 1922 Bentley, chassis 141, so it's the 141st Bentley made, and it's got the second motor ever made. But it's a 22 car, it's got experimental engine number 2 in it. And what's successful about it, it was owned by a guy called John Duff, who became one of the famous Bentley boys, and he wanted to do the Le Mans race, and he went to W.O. Bentley, and this was the first ever Le Mans race. He went to W.O. and said, I'm going to do the Le Mans race, I want you to, make it all go and everything. And he said, what nonsense. Just trust the French. How could you have a 24-hour race? There'll be nobody at the finish. He said, well, I'm going anyway. Oh, okay. Get the experimental engine number 2 out and put it in, and he tweaks it up, and they put a special little body on it, which we still have on it today. And off it went to France. And there were 34 other cars, French and Belgian cars. And they observed something interesting. Telecommunications wasn't big in those days, as you can appreciate. But they all had 4-wheeled brakes. And the Bentley only had 2-wheel brakes. And that's interesting. And anyway, the race started, and that was great, and they were lying first for a while, and then the brakes started to heat up and fail, and they sort of keep running off the end of the Mulsanne Straight with no brakes, back up. Anyway, finally they got a hole in the radiator, and had to bail out for an hour or two while they fixed it, and finally put it all back together again. They're now coming last. And they had to drive with a co-driver in those days, and he had Frank Clement, who was another Bentley boy, and W.O. Bentley even came over to watch the event. And after battling away through the field, they end up in 4th position, and at this stage they're breaking the lap record every single lap, and they ended up with the inaugural lap record at Le Mans at 69.94 miles per hour in 1923. Bear in mind that it's not like an ordinary racetrack, it was 14 miles around. And when we took the car back after we restored it, we took it back on a Bentley run which went around Le Mans. And I'm driving. I kept saying to my wife, Robin, are we there yet? This is getting 1 lap in, 14 miles. It's a fair way away around. But it was a lot of fun. That was great, a great moment and a great car. great provenance.
Well, Peter, you appeared on many of the episodes of the Motor Show over the years, including the first one.
No, I enjoyed the program and I enjoyed doing it. And of course you expanded into other things from there, and it was good being involved with it.
Walter Owen Bentley made a name for himself as a designer of aircraft engines. At the end of World War I, he started a company producing cars known for their speed and reliability, the Bentley Motor Company. One of the best-known Bentleys to come off the factory floor was the supercharged or blower Bentley. Karen Pearson takes a closer look at this magnificent vehicle.
When Bentley Motors began, they made a name for themselves building chassis fitted with a 3-litre engine. Back then, a Bentley left the factory as just a chassis, and customers or dealers had a body built to their own specifications. W.O. Bentley soon recognised the need for a larger engine to handle the weight of the heavy coachwork customers were building onto his chassis. Well-known Perth identity and entrepreneur Peter Briggs owns this car. Peter, when did the first 4.5-litre model come out?
1927 was the first unsupercharged 4.5-litre Bentley, and then they supercharged 50 so that they could race them at Le Mans. And this is the second of that 50.
So James, what are your impressions of the blower Bentley?
To my mind, it is the grand dame of the Briggs collection and represents Great Britain in its finest hour. Grand, noble and powerful.
The blower Bentley continued in production until 1931, but it proved to be an expensive exercise. The Great Depression also took its toll, and the Bentley Motor Company assets were bought up by Rolls-Royce. W.O. Bentley was considered one of the company's greatest assets and was part of the package, but the blower was the last W.O. Bentley designed car to be sold under the Bentley name. Karen Pearson for The Motor Show.
It's the AC Shelby Cobra, a car that was born out of a joint venture between British car maker AC and Shelby American from the USA. Karen Pearson finds out why it's one of the world's most sought-after cars.
Red, it's a convertible. It has a top speed of 270 kilometres per hour and it's gorgeous. That's why this 1966 AC Shelby Cobra is one of the world's most sought-after cars. Isn't that right, James Harwood?
Yes, Karen, it is. The big feature about the car is its wonderful engine, giving it such an electrifying performance. I recall that in 1987, its owner Peter Briggs drove it at Fremantle for the Speed Classic that we held down there on Victoria Quay and recorded a time of 12 seconds for the standing quarter mile.
In 1962, the AC Car Company adapted an existing chassis to accommodate a Ford V8 engine, and the first Cobra chassis was shipped from England for assembly in the US by Shelby American with the new Ford engine. Just over 1,000 had been built before production ended in 1968. But during that time, the engine had grown from 4.2 litres to a massive 7 litres. So James, this is one of the great Ford engines.
Yes, 7 litres, overhead valve Ford, wonderful engine, fed by a Holly downdraft carburettor, which produces 485 brake horsepower at 6,500 revs per minute. Staggering.
Okay, James, we've talked about the engine. What's she like to drive?
It's a very flighty car, having an aluminium body and a huge engine with a great output, so one can't take any liberties.
So just because it's worth $750,000, James, why can't I drive it?
I think it would require a little more experience than you've had, Karen, if you don't mind me saying so.
Well, I guess I'll be driving my own car home. Karen Pearson for The Motor Show. In 1906, no car manufacturer had succeeded in designing the perfect 6-cylinder. Henry Royce, master mechanic, came pretty close. He built his engine with an internal lubrication system and a smoother gearbox, and along the way helped pioneer the 6-cylinder engine. Silver Ghost chassis were tough enough to carry the weight of armoured car bodies into battle during World War I. Its design also made it one of the most popular cars of its time. It had a strong chassis, a finely tuned engine, and with a little help from the marketing department, the 4050 Rolls-Royce became the Silver Ghost.
Peter, perhaps you'd be kind enough to tell us the reason behind the name Silver Ghost.
Yes, James. All Rolls-Royces prior to the First World War were given names by their owners, and so when the factory built their demonstrator, They built it with silver plated components and silver painted body, and they made it look very beautiful. And with all the silver, of course, they gave it the name of Silver Ghost. And because of the body style and because it was the factory demonstrator, it became known everywhere as the Silver Ghost.
The association of the Silver Ghost continues today with the current production of the Silver Spirit and the Silver Wraith.
Although the Silver Ghost stayed in production from 1906 until 1925, early models were very different to later ones because of Henry Royce's constant pursuit for perfection. By the early 20s, other companies were building cars that equalled and even surpassed the Ghost, and the Rolls-Royce evolved into the Phantom series. The MG K3 Magnet had a production run of just 2 years. In 1933 and 1934, 31 of these cars were built for competition, with a 6-cylinder supercharged engine. After 1934, many MG K3 parts were interchanged, and it became difficult to follow the history of any one vehicle. This particular 1933 model has a very colourful past, but proving its ancestry was no easy task.
It's the most historic of all MGs ever made, the supercharged 6-cylinder MG K3. This is the third one made, and it raced in the 1933 Mille Miglia, driven by Count Johnny Lorani, the famous Italian driver, and Captain George Eyston. And they won their class.
Great history and more to come. The way that you have driven it with such verve and style at the Australian Grand Prix, Wanneroo Raceway, York and Albany adds to the great character of this car.
The K3 owed a lot of its form to a wealthy patron who wanted to compete in the 1933 Mille Miglia in a British car, and he was prepared to pay the expenses for doing so. Its design utilised many tried and tested features already used in previous MG models. Experience obviously paid off, making the MG K3 Magnet one of the most inspiring and exclusive of the MGs.
The Ocker York Flying 50 has become a motoring classic in WA, and this month will see the 15th annual running of the event. Putting the event together and joining us in the studio is Howard Wilcoxon from Around the House's Events Management. Good morning, Howard.
Good morning, mate.
We're celebrating 15 years. How did it all get started?
Well, it was actually the inspiration of Peter Briggs and James Harwood, proprietors of the York Motor Museum. They got the idea of why don't we publicise the Motor Museum in York by doing a reenactment of the famous Around the Houses motor racing, which used to be the principal form of motor racing throughout Australia, certainly up to the late 50s.
And I believe this year we've got a very big field.
Would you believe we have 130 cars plus motorbikes? It's actually a record field.
And there are a number of events as well for the different categories?
Yes, we have historic sports cars, and in that we take in cars such as the 1916 Hudson Super Special, and there's a 1927 Bentley, would you believe, wonderful 4.5 litre Bentley, and some quite other interesting exotica. We have historic racing cars, there's a couple of Brabhams in that, then there's GTs, classic saloons, sports saloons, and the famous, well, you would probably know the Appendix J race cars.
Right, and the Silver Wings too will be there.
The Silver Wings is in the historic sports cars. The Silver Wings was a 1927 Chrysler that actually set the 24-hour endurance record at Lake Perkalilly. I guess it's the car of the moment, because this is actually a magnificent replica of that exact car.
Well, our next guest is a registered builder, a quantity surveyor, the founding member of the Matilda Bay Brewing Company, and a man that I had the privilege of first interviewing in York in the late 1970s. He is, of course, Peter Briggs, a man with a passion for motor cars who, a couple of years ago, opened the terrific tourist attraction, the Fremantle Motor Museum. But Peter today joins us in studio as Executive Chairman of Westralian Nickel. Peter, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Peter, you've been in the resources industry for a long time. Why nickel?
Well, 30 years I think is a reasonable amount of time. Nickel, because I think it's the right commodity. The world needs it, China needs it, and the demand isn't going away.
Now, why the Pilbara? Interesting.
Well, because I think most of the Kalgoorlie nickel has been found, and nobody's really spent much time in the Pilbara. I mean, Rio Tinto did in the early 90s and established some nickel which we own today.
Now, obviously, you believe that the timing is right.
Yes, well, you never get the timing right in anything, but the nickel price is high, the stock market is an all-time high, and of course that little Australian company BHP Billiton is about to dump $9.2 billion on all those Western mining shareholders that are really nickel shareholders. So we think a bit of that will filter into the emerging nickel companies.
Now, you've got a pretty good team lined up.
We've got a great team of guys. Russell Goodwin, who's an experienced nickel geologist from the old days at Western Mining, and the rest of my team, a lot of them in the field waiting for the company to be listed so that we can start drilling and get on with the job.
How much nickel do you think is there?
Well, you don't know, but we've got grades up to 6%. We're going to concentrate on establishing the higher grade areas. We've got a resource of 30 plus million tonnes, but of a lower grade. Within that resource, we believe that there are a lot of high grade areas, and that's what we're going to try and find.
So what after-market action is the company planning?
Well, we've already done a lot of preliminary exploration, and we've established 14 new drill targets, and we will have a drill rig up on site. We already have a 10-man campsite up there, so on the day of listing we will be drilling with diamond drill rigs, and we're expecting a lot of action for the market.
When are you expecting to list?
Third week of July.
Now, you do have a prospectus out. If anyone is interested, what should they do?
Ring the office or get onto our website.
Peter Briggs, thanks very much for appearing on my programs over the years, and a particular thank you today for allowing us into this undercroft to have a chat and look at your fabulous cars.
Russell, it's always a pleasure to talk about old cars with somewhere that I've known for many, many years.
Thank you.
Thank you.